Happy Easter, everybody. It is so good to be together. Everybody's joining in different places. My name is Nate, if I haven't met you, and I am thrilled that you are here. We're here to celebrate something that happened 2,000 years ago. That's a really, really long time ago. And here's part of what's exceptional about it. We're going to talk about a man who never wrote a book, who never held a political office, a man who never led an army, a man who, as far as we know, never traveled more than 100 miles away from his hometown as an adult. A man who could easily be forgettable, but it's one thing. He defied death. And no one's ever done that before. And because of that, him defying death, Jesus being resurrected, it changed reality for human beings into its totality. And so now across the globe, in every language you can imagine, people are gathering to celebrate this event. It is beautiful. So over the past couple of months, we've been looking at one of the biographies of the life of Jesus. There's 4 of them. We've been looking at the one written by John. And John structures his book. He uses a literary tool. And he says there are 7 statements that Jesus makes about himself. In Greek, it's ego eimi, which means I am. And so for a world that has always been wondering who is God and what is Jesus and what did he claim about himself, in the book of John, he makes 7 statements about who he is. We're going to look at one of those today. And then there's 7 miracles. And these miracles are called signs in the book of John to help people believe. So whether you are a seasoned follower of Jesus or you're spiritually unresolved and you don't know what you believe, we're going to look at one thing Jesus says about himself and then one of the miracles, and it might help us indeed believe. What's unique about the book of John is John records 2 distinct resurrections. And they're somewhere between 30 days apart or even 2 weeks apart. It's a little bit hard to know chronologically where it lines up, but they're no more than 30 days apart. The first resurrection is found in John chapter 11, and it's the resurrection of a man named Lazarus. And then in 19, it's the resurrection of Jesus. And John makes some comparisons to the 2 resurrections that I think will help us to grasp what is happening. Okay, here's the setting for the first resurrection. There are 3 siblings. 2 sisters and a brother, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And they are very close to Jesus. They live in a town called Bethany, which is about 2.5 miles outside of Jerusalem. And Jesus seems to stay with them whenever he's in that region. And these 2 sisters all of a sudden watch their brother become ill. And his illness progresses to the point where they're deeply, deeply concerned. And they don't know what to do. The only thing they can think of is, we need to get Jesus here as soon as possible. So they send a messenger to Jesus saying, Lazarus, our brother, is gravely ill. We need you to show up. We believe that you could do something. No one else can help him. Jesus gets the message, stays where he is for 2 more days, and then eventually goes to Bethany. And by the time he arrives, his friend Lazarus has been in the grave for 4 days. Jesus shows up on the scene with 2 despondent, grief-stricken, and deeply disappointed women. Jesus didn't come when they expected him. He did not respond as quickly as they thought he should. And I think this is similar to so many of our prayers. We've prayed, Jesus, we need you to intervene right now, and he never seems to show up quite as quickly as we think he should. So this is the setting. Jesus interacts with Martha, and this is what we read. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, if you would have come when I called you, if you would have shown up before Lazarus died, if the deep regrets, my brother would not have died. So here's the reality. This is a great definition of faith. The reality is, my brother has died and I'm disappointed. But she says this, but I know that even now, even after my brother has been buried 4 days, God will give you whatever you ask. I was reading this text several weeks ago thinking about Easter weekend. And one of the things I felt like the Lord he wanted to communicate to some of us was this. It is never too late. It's never too late. Like Martha, God, you did not meet my expectations. It's been 4 days. There is a decomposition happening. But even now, and I think as human beings, some of us, the reality of shame, the reality of our failures, the reality of addictions and brokenness and hidden things in our lives, we come to this conclusion that we think it's too late for me. I've worn out the grace of God. I've disappointed people. I've made the same mistakes over and over. I've been through too much trauma, too much pain, and we think it's too late for me. Here's part of the message of Easter. It is never too late. I don't care what you have done. I don't care what has been done to you. I don't care how broken and fractured you feel. Jesus would say this, even now, God could do a miracle. The account of Lazarus' resurrection continues. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. This is one of these 7 statements. I am resurrection, I am life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. He's talking about there's a life after this life. There's physical mortality for all of us, but there's a life after this. And then he looks at her and says, do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. In the midst of this moment where she's like grieving so deeply, Jesus says, do you believe? Do you believe? And I think that's the question that Jesus still asks today. And I know that for some of us, we're early on and we're not sure what we believe, but that's the question Jesus asks. Here's what we typically do in our culture, very rational culture, highly developed sciences. We ask this question, do we understand? And that is an important question. I never want to disqualify that question. But Martha doesn't understand. She doesn't understand how someone who's been dead for 4 days could come to life. But Jesus doesn't ask her, do you understand? He asks this, in the midst of your lack of understanding, do you believe? And sometimes we get hung up on, I don't understand. And if I don't understand, then how could I believe? But Jesus says this, can you believe even when you don't understand? Confession. I've been following Jesus for decades. And there are things that I do not understand. But that's not what Jesus asks. He asks, do you believe? And I've come to this conclusion. If this brain had the capacity to understand everything about who God is and what he's doing in this world, that would be a very small God. If my cognitive abilities were large enough to comprehend all that God is doing, that's a really small God. I don't believe I'll ever fully understand here on this planet. But the question is, do I believe? Do I believe? As we move on, Jesus comes to where they've buried Lazarus. And when he has said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So in the first century, when you died, you were buried immediately before sundown, if at all possible. And they would take a long piece of cloth. They measure you and they make it about 4 times as long. And they would put your hands to your side, and then they would put myrrh and spices and different things that would kind of help with the process of decay. And then they would wrap this around you, and then they would tie the person, their hands and their feet. There was a separate cloth that went over one's head. And Jesus calls to Lazarus and says, come out. And can you just imagine what this was like? Right? And like we read it, oh, no big deal. What would you have done if you were there? This is like a mummy movie, right? You're like, right? Everybody's just freaking out. And I think they're running away. And Jesus says, hey, I want you to go over there and I want you to unwrap him. And the issue with the linen cloth and the separate cloth that covers the head is really important because it's going to be repeated by John in Jesus' resurrection. It means something. And so Lazarus is resurrected but incapacitated. So he's resurrected, but he's tied up. He's wearing a dead man's clothes. And Jesus says, your job is to go over and unwrap him. It's just beautiful, right? Scary, odd, wild. I had an interaction with somebody a couple weeks ago, and they were really disappointed by an interaction they had with somebody who's a part of this church. They just felt really hurt. This person just looked me in the eyes and said, why are the people that attend Faith Chapel so messed up? I said, great question. Great question. And I told them this story. I go, here's why. Because Faith Chapel's filled with mummies in recovery. We are resurrected, but a little messy, okay? We're still wearing some dead man's, some dead women's clothes. And here's the process, is Lazarus can't unwrap himself. He needs other people involved in the unwrapping process. And that's what we're doing. Sometimes it takes decades to unwrap all the death that is surrounding me. I'm alive, Jesus did that, but I need help to get clean, to dress in something new, in something appropriate. And that's why I can come to Jesus and I can be resurrected internally and still struggle with my addictions. I can come to Jesus and I can be resurrected and destined for eternity with him and still be overwhelmed and deal with depression and fear and anxiety. It's because I need to be unwrapped, and that's a community process. And it gets a little bit difficult and a little bit ugly. So there's Lazarus' resurrection. Now let's fast forward a matter of days. It is a similar setting, except now it's not just three siblings who are dealing with grief. It is everybody who loved and followed Jesus. They watched him die this agonizing, horrific death on the cross. And when Jesus died, their hopes, their dreams, everything died with them. And Jesus' body was quickly rushed into a burial because there's a Passover feast happening. And so Mary Magdalene, days later, on Sunday morning, comes to the grave of Jesus, and this is what she encounters. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. That's John who's writing this. And said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. So she visits the tomb. She's going to deal with her own grief. She wants to do it privately in her own way. And when she gets there, she sees that body is gone. And her first assumption is what? Somebody desecrated the grave. Somebody stole Jesus' body. Why would they do that? What is happening? So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter. This is John's way of having a little man versus man who runs faster, okay? John, he ran out the other disciple and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there. But he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen lying there as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place. It was separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, John wants us to know that he was really fast, also went inside. He saw, what did he see? He saw the strips of linen and he saw the cloth that covered the face. He saw and believed. Two things about the resurrection of Jesus. Number one, resurrection isn't just an event. Resurrection is a person. When Jesus stands up in John chapter 11, he makes this declaration in front of a dead man's tomb. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I embody resurrection and life. Part of why Jesus came to planet Earth was to reinvigorate, to recreate, to restart a creation and a race of human beings who had experienced death. It begins in chapter 3 of John's book, where Jesus is talking to a religious leader named Nicodemus, who's incredibly devout, but he doesn't understand what Jesus is doing. And this is what Jesus says to him: Nicodemus, you must be born again. And it's an ongoing theme throughout the book of John. That part of the human condition is this: we are corrupted and broken spiritually. And what is inside of us, our capacity to relate to know, and to follow God, has been destroyed. And we needed a resurrection spiritually. We needed someone to deal with the problem of sin and the problem of shame so that we could become alive spiritually. And Jesus says this: I am resurrection. And I am life. And when you bury Jesus in a tomb, you just buried resurrection. It's not going to stay there. Throughout the world, there are countless shrines. And these shrines are typically places where saints or great teachers or great religious leaders have been buried. And people make pilgrimages to these places. And you come to venerate, to pray, to ask a blessing from this deceased person. And there's some form of their remains still there. There's a temple, and it's said to have the tooth of the Buddha. Just one tooth remains. And people come from all over to come to this temple to be close to just a piece of what was the tooth of the Buddha. Do you know in Israel today, there are 7 distinct places that claim to be the burial place of Jesus? 7. And for all of them, for a small fee, you can see where Jesus was buried. There's 2 that are likely and 1 that's very likely. I've been there. Did you know there's one place in Japan that claims to be the burial place of Jesus? Kind of a long story there. Nobody knows. Why doesn't anybody know where Jesus was buried? Because he's resurrection and life. Nobody cared where he was buried. There's nothing to come visit. There's nothing to memorialize. There's no remains. Because Jesus is resurrection. Jesus came to give resurrection, to invest resurrection, to recreate human beings who have been dead and empty. He is resurrection and he is life. Resurrection is not just an event. It is a person, the person of Jesus. Here's the second thing. Jesus is still robbing graves. When Jake wrote that song, I thought, I love that line, man. He didn't know I was going to teach out of this passage, but I'm like, oh. Jesus is the great grave robber. And because his tomb is empty, it means he's still standing outside of everybody else's tomb. Part of why John is actually shocked and why he says, when I saw the linens, I believed is this, is he'd watched Lazarus come out of the tomb and Lazarus had to be unwrapped. But when John goes into Jesus' tomb, he sees everything that held Jesus. It had been vacated. And off to the side was the shroud that covered his head. And John realizes this is a different type of resurrection. I just saw Lazarus be resurrected, but somehow buried in a tomb was resurrection and life. And he came out of those grave clothes and he stood up, and whatever was covering his face, he untied it and folded it and put it on the side. And the minute that John sees, this is organized, this is empty, this is not somebody who was like half dead and crawled his way out. He uncovered his head and set it to the side. He is alive. He's resurrection and life. And now the same Jesus, if Jesus hadn't resurrected, this part would not be applicable. It would not be true. Now Jesus is still walking around and he's robbing graves. He's speaking people's names. into the decay and the death and the pain and the ugliness of human lives. He's calling your name. He's calling my name. He's saying, Nate, come out. In fact, 40 some years ago, he visited a kid, a little boy. And he said, Nate, come forth. And I hobbled out. He's calling your name, or he's calling your name. And then there's this ongoing process where he's still robbing the grave. There's not a week of my life that goes by where I find myself, I'm wearing a dead man's clothes, things that I'm resurrected but incapacitated. And he's saying, Nate, come out of that. Come out of that selfishness. Come out of that fear. Come out, move forward in the process of stripping away the death that has held me. I'm resurrected, but I'm being healed. I'm in process. Jesus is robbing graves. And he hasn't stopped, and he will not stop, because he is resurrection and he is life. He came out of the grave and he is still alive. He has defied death. Lazarus, poor guy, had to die twice. Right? He was resurrected, and then he got old again. And he died. Jesus is alive, and he is robbing graves. And it is never too late. And he calls you and I by name. Come forth. And he's taking off my grave clothes and clothing me with something beautiful and appropriate and right. Will you pray with me? Jesus, you are still robbing graves. I just want to make space for anyone, and you just say this. It is not too late for me. Whatever has happened, wherever I've been, whatever I've done, the message of Easter is this: but even now, after all that has happened, after all my failures, and Jesus is calling your name, bringing you to spiritual life. And if that is you, if Easter of 2024 is your moment of spiritual resurrection, and you hear Jesus calling your name, would you do this? It's going to take some courage, but would you just raise your hand and wave at me? I want to make eye contact with you. You're being resurrected. Yes, 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 ma'am. All right, yeah. I see all you guys right there. Yes, in the back. There as well. The center section, yeah. I see you. Yes. I love it. And on my left, you're right. Yeah. Yes. Yes. If over here, yeah. Sorry I missed you earlier. If you're in the balcony, you just catch my eye, wave at me. Yeah. He's calling your name. He's calling your name. Yes and yes. Yes, 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 yes. Come out of that grave. Everybody, if you're watching or listening in another place, the Lord sees you. Step out of that grave. Then for all of us, Lord, thank you that you are calling us to a deeper and more profound sense of resurrection. You're calling us out of our grave clothes and into a new way of living. We are grateful that you are resurrection and you are life. Amen. Amen. Hey, behind me are a group of people that have made the decision to be baptized. A whole bunch of people this weekend. It is so much fun. And in just a few minutes, everybody's going to cheer for you guys. Now, you're going to hear this. When you go into the water, whoever's baptizing you is going to say this: you're buried with Christ as you go into the water, and you're raised to new life. And that's exactly what is happening. When Jesus was baptized, when he came up out of the water, this is what he heard. His Father said this: "This is my beloved Son, in him I'm well pleased." Ladies, when you come up out of that water, I want you to hear this from your Creator. This is my beloved daughter. In her, I'm well pleased. Gentlemen, this is my beloved son. In him, I'm well pleased. We are so proud of you. Thank you for letting us be a part of your baptism. Will you just applaud?